Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those present and our colleagues online, it gives me great pleasure as the Dean of Faculty and Chair of the Research and Innovation Committee, to introduce you to Rich Baxter. He doesn't know it, but I met him a few weeks ago at a SEGCAT award-giving ceremony. And I was absolutely blown away by the quality of the project, which Rich is doing as well. It's going to be really interesting. I know colleagues from the Environment Department sort of rubbing their hands that this is right up their street, but it's also really going to be interesting about the methodological choices which have been chosen. And again, it's a fantastic project. I've had a preview of it, and I'm really pleased you're here, Rich, and thank you very much for giving up your time, and also to Dr. Gerard for enabling this presentation and speech as well. So without further ado, I'm over to you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for coming, and good afternoon.
Everything's fine.
I think it's working. People can hear me.
They can hear you?
Yeah.
Okay then.
Okay, good afternoon, or good morning for those online. Good evening. There we go. My name is Rich Baxter. Thanks very much for the introduction, Michael. I'm just going to talk to you about some of the research that's been going on in Seychelles since 2011 concerning the Aldabra giant tortoises, with a long-term view to rewild and restore islands in the Seychelles with giant tortoises, creating wonderful habitats and beautiful islands that will be resilient in the future. So I'll just give a brief introduction to the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance. So I'm the project director of the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance. It was set up in 2019 by a group of philanthropists to create cooperation between all the different countries in the Western Indian Ocean, so Mauritius, Madagascar, Reunion and Rodrigues and Seychelles, who are all working in some ways with giant tortoises. And so the idea is to try and bring collaboration together between all of us to better our understanding of rewilding with giant tortoises, but also how we can work together to make islands more sustainable for the future. So we do that through three main ways: safeguarding wild populations of the tortoises. This is usually through policy and working with the government closely to create legislation to protect the giant tortoises. We want to rewild empty islands. I'll get into that later, with giant tortoises, and we like to promote the Aldabra giant tortoise, the iconic giant tortoise of the Seychelles, as a bastion of conservation for the wider region, but also globally. We do that with 5 pillars. Firstly, where our focus is rewilding. We justify the rewilding work through a lot of research based on rewilding islands, but also the wild range itself, Aldabra atoll. We do ecosystem restoration, so that could be planting trees, removing invasive species, and increasing populations of giant tortoises. We also do a lot of outreach, like giving the talks here, social media, YouTube, and going to schools. And then finally, we work with hotels to promote the giant tortoise as this icon that we hope it is. Just another brief overview of what we're up to this year. So IOTA's got quite a lot of projects on, but the 4 main ones that we're focused on is the Aldabra giant tortoise census. So we're working with the Ministry of Environment to count all the tortoises in Seychelles. So if you can help us with that, that would be greatly appreciated. We are also working on the red list assessment. The IUCN red list assessment for the giant tortoise has not been done since 1996. And we have been asked to try and redo the assessment and get a new assessment for it, whether it remains vulnerable, which it is at the moment, or becomes less threatened, or maybe the other way. Hopefully not. We're also carrying out a rat eradication on Curious Island, which will kick off this month. And then we're also working with the government on the Giant Tortoise Action Plan, which is a national policy to try and figure out what we're going to do with all the tortoises. From a research perspective, we're very much focused on seed germination, trying to understand how the tortoises better, when they're on an island, how they are good at dispersing seeds and how the seeds benefit from going through a tortoise. We've done this experiment quite a few times in Mauritius, and so we're doing that at the moment. We're looking at how to figure out carrying capacity using on different islands, using different habitat types, but also habitat use. To understand how many tortoises can fit on certain islands. And then more nitty-gritty research that is really groundbreaking and pioneering, which is genetic based, looking at aging and sexing, whereby we'll be able to take blood samples from tortoises and age them. So no more of people saying it's 250 years old, it's 1,000 years old, it's 20 years old. We'll be able to give a reasonable estimate within 5 years of an age. And then also, when we try to sex tortoises at young ages, it's not possible. So unless you do surgery to check whether they've got ovaries or not, you have to rely on when traits start to develop as they get older. But we're working on a technique that hopefully we'll be able to use a blood sample when they're very young and figure out if they're male or female, which will benefit us going forward as we manage populations on islands. So, a little bit about IOTA. So now we go into some history of giant tortoises in the Western Indian Ocean. So this was the Western Indian Ocean 1,500 years ago. It was full of giant tortoises. There were two main clades of giant tortoise in the Western Indian Ocean. So you have the Cylindrospis of the Mascarenes. So this was 5 tortoises across Mauritius, Rodrigues, and Reunion. Reunion had 1 tortoise, and then Rodrigues and Mauritius had 2 different types of different species of tortoise. One was, you can see here, sort of a browser, so it can reach very, very high up in the trees to eat fruits and leaves. And the other one was a grazer, so much more low down to the ground, where they would graze on the grasslands. And then Madagascar also had Aldabrachelys and another species, but it's not considered a giant tortoise. And then we have Aldabrachelys in the Seychelles group as well. So that was 1,500 years ago, and unfortunately, when people find tortoises, it doesn't go very well for the tortoises. And so this is the situation today, where we only have the Aldabra giant tortoise left, Aldabrachelys gigantea. Okay, and that luckily survived all of the exploitation because Aldabra was so remote. It's possible that people were harvesting tortoises from Aldabra but couldn't find them all. So those ones that were managed to hide from people have then gone on to become the population that we know today. And unfortunately, by the 1800s, all the tortoises of the Mascarenes were exploited and removed, usually by explorers on their ships who were using the tortoises as a sort of larder, a living larder, because they can stay on ships for a long time. They don't need food or water for many months, and then the sailors would be able to just turn them over and have a good lunch. But as I say, luckily, Aldabra was protected, and so tortoises were moved from Aldabra as far ago as 1870 to Mauritius, and then further afield to Rodrigues. Also, tortoises came from Aldabra to the inner islands of Seychelles. So because of this, we're now in a situation whereby we have a wild population that is very well protected on Aldabra atoll, and then we have rewilded populations in Rodrigues, Mauritius, Seychelles, and now Madagascar. So I'm going to talk a bit about this towards the end of the presentation, but we're going to focus now on tortoise rewilding and captive breeding. For those online that don't know where the Seychelles is, this is where the Seychelles is. Very far away in the middle of the Indian Ocean, about 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers north of Madagascar, in the very warm seas of the Western Indian Ocean. This is the EEZ, the boundary of the Seychelles. We're going to focus on the 2 main areas, but there are 115 islands spread out within this zone, making up about 455 square kilometers. Between the inner islands and Aldabra, there is approximately 1,000 kilometers. So Aldabra is where we'll go to first. So this is the remarkable Aldabra atoll. It is what to say about Aldabra when you've got a short amount of time. But it's 35 kilometers long, 14 kilometers wide, makes up 155 square kilometers. It's the largest raised coral atoll in the world. It's also protected by UNESCO, and as Seychelles gave it that protection early on, so it's had a lot of protection for a long time, which is why you can see on the right here a lot of giant tortoises. So this is on the east side of Gigantea. I don't know if this works, but no. So the east side of Gigantea, which is the east side of Aldabra, is where you'll find the highest densities of tortoise, probably in the world. I've never tried to count how many there are in that photo, but you can see this across the entire coastal dunes. It's been untouched for probably about 8,000 years, with some exploitation happening with mangroves, tortoises, turtles. But what you're looking at, 80,000 years, but what you're looking at are processes that have been going on for millennia. So it's an atoll that is so important because we can look back in time, understand what the tortoises are doing, what the other animals are doing on the atoll, and try and take that understanding to how we look at rewilding them and restoring populations in the Seychelles. This is a satellite camp on Aldabra where researchers would go and study whatever they're studying. So it's very remote, very rough conditions for both tortoises and researchers. But luckily, it's been managed very well by the Seychelles Island Foundation. So they've set up a research station there, and they create a lot of collaborations with researchers to come and look at particular things that are happening on the atoll. In our case, we were a group from the University of Zurich, and we went down to Aldabra to specifically study the giant tortoise and get a further understanding from what we gained in the 70s when the Royal Society were looking at them, and then we went on and sort of used newer technology to take that information forward. From there, we were able to generate quite a lot of research. This is the science director of the Indian Ocean Tortoise Alliance, Dennis Hansen. And through that, we've been able to collaborate with many different scientists and partners to create research. I'm not going to go through the entire list of all the research that we've been doing over the past 13 years or so, but it's been generating a lot more information that we can then use to better the conservation of the Aldabra giant tortoise. I'm just going to go through two very quick examples. Firstly, my research on the movement of giant tortoises. You may not believe it, but giant tortoises do move, and it turns out they move quite far. So we strapped on these very large GPS units. They're large because of the battery size. Nowadays you can use solar loggers, but back in the day that was what we had to use, which recorded about 4 years of data for each individual tortoise. We strapped that on 30 different tortoises across the atoll to understand what they were up to and to get some insight into their sort of daily lives. So I'll just try and play this video. So this is a video of the tortoises that were from eastern Gigantea. So this is the largest sort of land area on Aldabra. So they have a lot more area to roam. What you want to focus on is the green one. I think I can use the pointer here. This one. You want to focus on this one and this blue one. Because what they... Oh, I don't know how you do that. Because these were some of the most remarkable sightings that we found. It's very fast. And how do I get back to pointer? Okay, so we're looking at a year's worth of movement types. So now the green one is running away inside into the inner areas of the island, stays there for about 4 or 5 months, and then it will start to return straight back to where it came from before. And it does it again. The same with the blue one. So these kinds of characteristic movement types, which can be associated to things like buffalo, birds, are what we call migrations. I'll play it again. This time, if you look at the other ones, they're moving a lot, but they're not sticking to one place, while the green and the blue one were going from one place in time and then moving to another and spending more time there and then coming back again. So this is what we classify as migrations. So this was quite surprising. And then it meant that we should probably try and categorize the different types of movement that we see of giant tortoises on Aldabra. Through the research, we were able to find 3 main types of movement. We're refining this at the moment using higher resolution analysis, but we were surprised to find, well, not really surprised to find, what we call residents. These are tortoises that have a very nice habitat and don't do very much. They have a very small core range of about 350 meters squared, and they will stay within that range for the data that we used. They might move out of that in time. We have to also remember that all of the data that we're looking at is only 4 years of a tortoise that lives 120 years. So it's a snapshot in their life. From the residents, which is these smaller home ranges, we then move to what we call a local migrator. So this is a tortoise that is moving between individual core ranges a lot of the time. So they're always moving around. This could be maybe they've got knowledge of different resources that are on at different times of year, but they can continually move through their landscape between these core areas on the same path. Now, when you're there on Aldabra looking at this, you can't see a path. It's not like in the Galapagos where they create these tortoise tunnels and they maintain these paths for themselves. On Aldabra, it's just bush and rock and grass, and there's nothing really you can call a path. So it was really interesting to then walk the lines that they were walking to try and figure out what their cues were to understand their habitat. Needless to say, I was not able to do so. And then we have the classic migrator. So this was really surprising to see. It had been written about in the 1970s of tortoises moving from the coastal dunes to inland pools. So what we see here is a classic migration where there's a tortoise that stayed in one place for a long period of time, and then it has a very fast, I'll use that term loosely, movement inland where it stays for a couple of months before returning back to the same spot. So this is what is defined as a migrator. We think this is likely because the dune grass starts to deteriorate during the dry season, and so they head inland to where the pools are, and they can stay within the pools until the grass starts to recover on the dunes. From this research, we were able to start to figure out how they use Aldabra. And then there was another researcher, Rona Walton. She created a very nice veg map of the atoll. And then from there, we were able to categorize all the different types of habitat on the atoll between all the different islands. So here we can see island proportion, so how much of each habitat type is on the island, and then you can see within the home range of the tortoise how much of the habitat they are using. So proportionally, we find that for open mixed scrub, even though proportionally on the island it's pretty low, they actually use a lot of it comparatively to the amount. And that's the same for Picard and Malabar, the two islands which have the smaller population of tortoise. And on Gigantea, where you have the highest number of tortoises, you can see that the grassland is a very tiny proportion of the atoll, of the island, but the tortoises are using a proportionally larger amount. So the grassland is really, really a key habitat for the tortoises on there. And just to give you an illustration of what it looks like, so this is what we call open mixed scrub, but you've also got a little bit of grassland. This grassland, although it looks like a golf course, is actually created by the giant tortoises, and we call this tortoise turf. And it's a mix of different herbs and sedges and grasses that have been clipped short for thousands and thousands of years, to the point where now some people think that they've evolved just to stay short. So there's still more research I could describe. Maybe we'll leave that for next year. But those are the two examples I wanted to show you because they're relevant to how we then restore islands. So Aldabra, although it's been remote, it does have its threats. These are threats that are related to climate change, so rising sea levels. Aldabra itself is only 8 meters on average above sea level, so any sort of significant rise in sea level will threaten certainly the lagoon, and then probably the coastal dunes as well. Aldabra's been seeing longer droughts and higher ambient temperatures for the last decade, so this is obviously quite concerning, especially for the grass, because the grass is very short. It can't survive. The other thing about Aldabra is that the soil is very, very thin. So once you have longer drought periods, this just basically does not have the structure to support grassland, especially when you have 80,000 tortoises trampling on it. So this is really concerning. And then higher temperatures will affect how tortoises behave. Tortoises are reptiles, they get their energy from the sun, and so any kind of change in the amount of sun they receive or the temperatures in which they are operating may be detrimental to their behavior, which has a further detriment to how they interact with their environment. And then finally we have invasive species. So these could be from rats and cats to plants that have an impact on Aldabra and then potentially also the tortoises. So because Aldabra has these existential threats, or not even existential, real threats, we would like to start to see tortoise populations on higher islands start to act as a sort of assurance colonies for the wild population. So we'll just move to the inner islands now. So this is the main, what we call the main group of islands in the Seychelles. This is where the international airport is and the capital city, Victoria. So you can see that it makes up 42 islands. It's between all of them is roughly the same amount of land as Aldabra, right? So that's just to give you the impression of how big Aldabra is. These islands are not coralline, they're granitic, so they're much higher than Aldabra, which is obviously a benefit if we want to put tortoises there and because of the risk of rising sea levels. And there are many what we call empty islands. So the inner islands have tortoise populations on them at the moment. I don't know if you can see the colours on there, but we've separated the tortoise herds that we know of into two different categories. One is empty or managed, so these are empty islands that don't have any tortoises on them, or they have tortoises on them, but they're either kept in pens or they are managed by supplementary feeding or being looked after, if you will. And then we have rewilded islands. So rewilding for us is about creating functions in the ecosystem that the tortoises perform on large scales. So tortoises are free roaming on these rewilded. They're not looked after by people, they're just allowed to be a tortoise. So we have quite a few islands there where you can demonstrate that, and then we have Silhouette, which is a bit of both. So we want to focus on all of the islands, of course, how to better manage the rewilding ones in terms of how do we reinforce those populations, and then how do we create sustainable populations, viable populations on these empty and managed islands. As an example, we have the wild population, which is on Aldabra atoll, where we think the population is around 100 to 150,000 tortoises. Compare that to the inner islands, which are each island is much, much smaller, of course, but we have Frigate Island, which has the most tortoises outside of Aldabra that we know of. Certainly, probably the highest population of rewilded giant tortoises in the world, with over 2,500 tortoises. Then we have Curious Island with just over 200, and then Desroches with around 150. So there's still work to be done, and a lot of these islands can carry a lot more than the current situation suggests. But why the tortoise? Why are they important for islands? This is a very complicated diagram. They are big eaters, so not only are they very large animals, they can reach up to about 250 kilograms and stand at a height of around 1.3 meters, but they are able to eat very large pieces of fruit. So they can take a whole fruit into their gullet, which then goes through their digestive tract, which takes about 18 days, and then comes out in this big pile of dung where the seeds are ready in basically a ball of fertilizer. So they're excellent seed dispersers. Because of this, they're what we call ecosystem engineers. So they're not only are they dispersing seeds, but they're also dispersing nutrients. And then at the same time, they are eating all the plants. So they create these layers within the island where other animals can use. So this is why we use the term ecosystem engineer. And they can do this over a very long period of time. So this is the other thing to bear in mind when you think about working with tortoises, that you're not going to see the end of your project. Your projects will be carrying on for hopefully hundreds and hundreds of years. And they'll be doing this process slowly but steadily over time, which has a huge positive benefit to the islands. And one final thing is that they can, as we've seen, they can walk long distances over a long period of time, which means that they can disperse seeds over larger areas. So this is why they're critical for islands, certainly in the Seychelles and the Western Indian Ocean, but they could also be used to replace other animals that are extinct that do a similar function. But this is not about those animals for now. So what do we call when we're thinking about tortoise rewilding? Well, we're thinking free roaming herds. So they breed well, they become viable populations. Rewilding is still a concept that can be controversial, especially if you're replacing an extinct animal with an analog species. But we consider them to be easily controlled. If you've lost control of your giant tortoise herd, something's gone drastically wrong. So if there are too many, you can take a few off. Again, this is something we need to explore, and I'll go into that in a minute. They can facilitate habitat restoration, so island restoration, because they are efficient engineers. So these are the benefits we see of creating larger populations on all of the inner islands. How do we do that? Typically we translocate tortoises, so similar to what the sailors used to do in the 16 and 1700s. We put them on boats and then we send them to islands. So we select tortoises from a population or a group of tortoises that we have access to. We then quarantine them, so this is basically just to ensure that they're not eating anything that you don't want to be going to your island. We then transport them either by barge or helicopter. Then quarantine again at the destination. This is to check their health, to make sure they're okay, and then also to monitor anything that's in the dung that you don't want on your island. And once you're satisfied all of that is clear, you can then release them onto the island, where monitoring, so post-release monitoring, is essential. Again, seeing where they're going, what they're eating, and if they're being healthy. Also monitoring the habitat to make sure that there's no detriment to the habitat. This is all encompassing. So I just want to go to one of the examples that I mentioned before, which is Frigate Island. So Frigate Island has a very nice history with giant tortoises. It didn't have any supposedly before 1965. No problem. In 67, 31 tortoises were introduced, and now we're at 2,500. So how can this happen? Okay, it's probably more, I don't know, but how can this happen? How can you have just 31 tortoises, adult tortoises, and then 40 years, 50 years later, you've got a considerable number? Well, it had a few chapters within its, the population's had a few chapters in its lifetime. It steadily grew with further introductions in the 70s, and then a key point was when they developed a hotel on the island, and unfortunately introduced rats. But they were very quick to eradicate those rats. So we're not sure if the population of rats had any huge detrimental impact to the tortoise population at the time, which was already very low. By the late 90s, there was around 300 tortoises, and then the hotel started functioning. The owner had a very good idea. He was wondering why he wasn't seeing any baby tortoises, and so came up with a solution by, if workers on the island found a baby tortoise, they would bring them to him and he would pay them 100 rupees. So this meant, rather than the tortoises disappearing in pockets off the island, they were now staying on the island. And so they had a very large nursery full of giant tortoises. So this is what we call a head starter project. These are very, very effective. They work for many different species, but they work especially well with giant tortoises because they breed well. And they lay around 8 to 20 eggs per nest. So if you have a good breeding stock, you can actually quickly generate a lot of tortoises very quickly. So those head starters started the population increasing exponentially. Then there was another influx of tortoises from Silhouette Island. Around 100 tortoises were introduced, and these were of breeding age. So again, you've already got this head starting program happening. You've then got more breeding tortoises coming into the island. So it's likely that this really pushed the population to grow faster. So the reason why you've got the blue line here, which is kind of gappy, is because the census that were done were not always regular, and then they were done in different ways. In 2019 or 2018, we did a full count. We walked the entire island, counted every single tortoise we could find, which came to around 2,500. I believe they're still doing this process now. So when we look at this graph, you can start to worry, like, well, if this red line carries on like this, what's going to happen? So we always have to ask ourselves, how many is too many? So there was a paper done with Gerard and Justin Gerlach where they took an equation to estimate the carrying capacity of the islands in the Seychelles. And in that paper, they have an estimate of 3,000 tortoises. I say conservative because it was basically about habitat type rather than habitat use, which you could potentially also use in the model. These are not real lines. I just made them up just to sort of estimate, to illustrate what can potentially happen. So what we saw in Aldabra is what you get with the grey line at the top. So we know that Aldabra's population was very, very low, and then during the 50s and 60s and 70s, it grew very, very quickly. Went up to about 150,000. Then the researchers went back in the 90s, and they started seeing all these carcasses everywhere. This suggests that they've overshot their carrying capacity, and then there's a die-off. Since then, it's been very, very stable. So this is a likely scenario that could happen on Frigate or any of these inner islands. However, these islands have very, very suitable habitat compared to Aldabra. They're not harsh. They've got lots of shade, lots of water, great nesting areas. So there is a potential that these tortoises don't overshoot and can actually keep on increasing, which means you probably have to manage your population. The other thing could be that they've already reached the carrying capacity, and because of this, there's too many, let's say there's too many females and not enough places for the females to nest. There's certainly enough food, but that might start slowing down the rate of growth for the population. So maybe we're seeing it's already stabilizing. Again, more research needs to be done to understand how we determine carrying capacity of islands, and at what point does the impact of your tortoise herd become detrimental to the habitat. So we call it when you have, like, if you see it in captivity and you have too many tortoises in captivity, you will not have grass very quickly. We call this denudation. And this is when the impact of the tortoises is so severe that it basically starts reversing all of the work that you're trying to do. We don't know what that is. So we're working hard to try and figure that out. But Frigate is a very, very good example of how we can think about this kind of thing. Mainly because their population distribution is it's very good to look at as a viable population. You've got a healthy number, a good ratio of male to female, so it's like roughly 1-to-1. You've got the different size classes. So males are larger than females. We're seeing this here as well. And then unknown is basically tortoises that we were not able to sex, but are of certain size classes, and this is what you want. You want younger tortoises coming through as the older ones die off. So this is a really good thing to see. So if we look at that and then compare it to the Aldabra population, it looks very, very similar. So the population on Frigate looks very, very similar to the population we see on Aldabra. The concerning thing, however, for Aldabra, if you look at these pyramids, is that there are very few small tortoises found. So when you're thinking about your population and creating these viable populations that are sustainable for a long period of time, you need a lot of recruitment. And what we're seeing on Aldabra might be that there's not enough recruitment. Again, they're very small tortoises when they're babies, and they're very difficult to find. They're very cryptic. So that could also be the reason, but that is of a little bit concerning when you see these graphs. So again, is that something we need to consider as a justification to start increasing tortoise populations on these inner islands? But one of the benefits of doing it is that you start to see the impact of the giant tortoises. So this was on Frigate, and you've got a couple of examples of here of how tortoises impact the environment on these islands. So top left, we've got what we call a browsing line. You'll typically see this in forests where there are lots of deer, or other places where you've got goats, and there's a maximum height they can reach in which they can eat. So in this case, this is a large Indian almond tree where the tortoises have been eating the leaves underneath, and they've been doing it for a long time. So now there's this beautiful browsing line where they can go in under the shade, hide from the sun at the middle of the day, and they protect themselves that way. Secondly, the birds also love this. They're able to access the canopy, the lower canopy, and then dive down onto the ground safely and eat the insects that they find there. And then your top right and bottom left, we've got what we call the tortoise turfs. So these might look like they're manicured by people with bush cutters or whatever, but I can assure you this is just giant tortoises in large numbers, keeping grass very, very short. And these are paths that people use as well. So we can see that that's the impact from herbivory. And then on the right, we have seed dispersal. So this is the Indian almond tree seeds that have been gone through a giant tortoise and now are ready to germinate. The other thing to bear in mind also when you look at these photos, especially on top right, you've got these clumps of grasses that they're not eating. These are actually really important areas because tortoises will still walk through these areas. They might not eat those grasses or herbs for particular reasons, but they might deposit dung in those areas. This means that they're not going to be eating the seedlings that are germinating from this dung. And this is how the dynamics of the island, where trees grow and all of that, comes from tortoises walking around. This is why they are just key for habitat restoration on islands. So that's kind of the research behind everything that we're doing and an example. And then just from the IOTA point of view, we've, working with Gerard, we've sent tortoises to 2 islands, to Reed Island in 2018. We sent 10 as a pilot study to help the Seychelles magpie robin population. And then we went to Grand Sur, where we sent 30 tortoises from Frigate to Grand Sur to create more dynamics within the system of the island there, where there's been a lot of habitat restoration and the introduction of other birds. So the tortoises are doing very well on both those islands. We're hoping to go back to Reed this year to protect not the magpie robin this time, but seabirds. There's a problem with a particular species of tree that has very sticky seeds that is starting to overrun the island, and the seabirds unfortunately are being impacted by that. So we're hoping that by introducing tortoises, they will start knocking down these trees and eating seedlings to reduce that population. So when we're talking about the rewilding, where do we get these tortoises from? In these two examples, we were able to get tortoises from Frigate Island because of their large population. But since the 70s, tortoises have been removed from Aldabra atoll and brought to the inner islands. So these are 2 photos from that time where you can see a very, very strong man lifting up a probably, 120, 150 kilo tortoise over his head and depositing it into a mini mahe and then taking it off to the main ship to be sent to Seychelles. These tortoises are now all over the world. They're in something like 176 different institutions and zoos, as well as private collections. So they're kind of an ambassador for Seychelles around the world, and hopefully we try to work with that group of institutions to promote the Aldabra giant tortoise and the Seychelles for the conservation work that it does. But in Seychelles, they have become giant pets. So there's a tradition in Seychelles, which may still be going on, whereby when you have a baby girl, especially, they get given a giant tortoise as a present. They then grow up with this tortoise, and then at the banquet they would consume the tortoise. That consumption, I believe, has stopped, but that has meant there are lots and lots of tortoises in ownership of people in the Seychelles. This goes from private ownership to hotels, as well as landowners that have them as well. And we are somewhat concerned with the issues that surround this. It is a protected species under the Wildlife Act of Seychelles, and there are some welfare issues around keeping the giant tortoises. They grow very, very large. They do require quite a bit of maintenance and care. But unfortunately, what you see a lot of is poor kitchen scraps, too much fruit, and not a very good diet for what they need, especially in terms of water as well, and then also how people interact with those tortoises. So this is the situation here in Seychelles, but they're kept as pets all over the world. They're in America, Taiwan, Thailand, wherever you can think of. And because of this, And the reason for this is because they've been exported from the Seychelles. Okay, so this is a graph since the 2000s, where between Mauritius and Seychelles. So tortoises are also, Aldabra giant tortoises are also being bred in Mauritius and sold to the pet trade. This is completely legal. It is the giant tortoises on CITES Appendix 2. CITES is the governing body that regulates what can be sold and what cannot be, or not what can be traded and what cannot be traded. So for example, rhino is on Appendix 1 and is not allowed to be traded internationally unless for science reasons. Giant tortoises are Appendix 2. So what you can see here is a graph where tortoises were regularly exported from the Seychelles and Mauritius, and they kind of follow each other along quite nicely. And then in 2012, regulations changed in the Seychelles, and the export number went very high. So this quick growth has changed the dynamic of the market, the pet trade in general. So what we can see here as well as a further example, this is where Mauritius and Seychelles exported to. So you can see here Seychelles exported primarily to Hong Kong and Taiwan over the 20 years. Okay, while Mauritius focused on Thailand and the US. Those then get sent to distributors, pet distributors within those countries that then sell them on the pet trade for considerable sums of money. And it's pretty much all the countries in the world you can think of has had some kind of import of a giant tortoise. And then on the right we have a graph here where this is the trends to exporting countries. So where Seychelles has been exporting to. And you can see there towards the end of 2020, there starts to see a big decline in the Seychelles, this graph is the countries exporting giant tortoises. What you can see here, if you look at the red line, which is Seychelles, there's a sharp decline of around 1,000 tortoises not being exported, and at the same time there's a very quick increase from Hong Kong of about 1,000 tortoises. This suggests that Hong Kong are now in a position whereby they can export themselves. So they have breeding tortoises that they can export. This also, because Hong Kong is in China, means that they can directly import into China, and we don't know where these tortoises end up. So, I know that sounds like a bleak situation, but it could be a very good situation for us. Because the breeders are so good at what they're doing, they've kind of made the market, they've produced another kind of market where other exporters are now in the game. They have bred a lot and they continue to breed, but they have limited space. So because of that, they don't have the conditions necessarily to breed perfect tortoises, is what the pet trade want, and then they're undesirable. So the market decides they don't want them. So now we have an increase in surplus giant tortoises. So a lot of the breeders have, there's regulations in Seychelles, so you can't sell tortoises over 30 centimeters plastron length, and a lot of breeders have this size of tortoise. So what are we going to do with them all? Is it a possible source for rewilding projects? Well, how do you choose the perfect tortoise? It does depend on the project. Primarily you want tortoises that are over 20 kilograms, 30 kilograms. A, they're going to create more of an impact on your island, and B, they're less likely to be put in pockets. So that's kind of from a size point of view. Sex determination is difficult, but if you can, try and find tortoises that you know are male or female, so you're kind of gauging or getting a good idea about how your sex ratio will be. And then we can produce, and then you should be looking for islands that don't have large giant tortoise populations that need bolstering. So this is what we're looking for when we think about the tortoises that potentially we could get from the surplus stock. They're very good at being translocated, so they're very easy to move from the point of view that they're quite hardy. They're not necessarily easy to move because they're very heavy. So, but they do have a lot of post-translocational survival. So when you see them, we've not seen any fatalities from them being moved or any injuries. They're monitored closely to understand their impact on the islands. You can have relatively quick success as well when you look at how the tortoises are growing and putting on weight and enjoying the habitat. And we go back to that age-old question of how many is too many. So we're still thinking about how we can optimize using captive bred tortoises to bolster the populations of these inner islands. And one of the primary case studies that we've seen is in Mauritius, whereby they use head starting programs similar to the one that we saw on Frigate. This is on Francois Legare Reserve in Rodrigues, where they use these tortoises to replace the extinct Mauritian tortoise or Rodriguan tortoise. And it's the same story there that we've seen on Frigate, in that they start to create dynamics in the ecosystems that benefit the ecosystem. Here we've got a tortoise walking through the habitat, it's large amount of dung, and then we've got ebony seedlings sprouting out of the dung. So there's a lot of, we're still trying to work on the plan to try and create a pathway for us all to collaborate and get these tortoises out of conditions that aren't necessarily to the iconic status that they are in. And so we want to think about the benefits of using captive tortoises. So we have a large stock of healthy juveniles and adults in captivity across the inner islands, especially with the breeders. You could rapidly increase these tortoise populations given the access to do so and the political will to do so. Obviously, we'd have to collaborate with partners, breeders, and the island managers, and it would also reduce pressure on the rewilded populations by ensuring that we've created these resilient herds that can withstand other threats from poaching or climate change. There are some challenges, of course. There's logistics, always difficult in the Seychelles. We're surrounded by lots and lots of water, and we need a lot of manpower to be able to do this. I've put reduced genetic diversity, but we're slowly learning that this might not necessarily be the case. So we're looking into that at the moment to try and figure out what level of inbreeding giant tortoise populations can handle, but it seems like a lot. The willingness for breeders and private owners to donate. So we're having a lot of discussions with the breeders, but also private owners are coming to us and saying, please, can you take our tortoise and put them on one of the islands, and they're free roaming, and this seems to be working very well. We don't know the sex ratio because of the age, and then there might be some issues with poaching for the pet trade, either locally or internationally. So I want to just leave on a sort of schematic of how we envisage islands to be rehabilitated. Luckily in Seychelles we are ahead of this. We're not at year zero, okay? We're kind of in 5 to 10 range. So, but you can quickly restore islands and their habitats very quickly by using giant tortoises and other conservation management tools. But what we want to see is these latter stage rewilded islands, similar to a reed and frigate, warrant more species protection for the giant tortoise, and to create functional ecosystems that are resilient to climate change threats in the future. And I'll leave you with this beautiful picture of all the giant tortoises on Frigate Island. Giants in the mist. So, thank you very much, and any questions? Okay.
Thank you so much for the presentation. You have talked of and about sites and exportation of endangered species. And perhaps one of the challenges that nation states face in the regulation of endangered species is perhaps relative to the question of whether or not they should export them on the basis of sites appendix 1 and 2. And my question is, is, in your opinion, should states not export endangered species merely on the basis of the fact that these are endangered elsewhere when they are in excess in their own jurisdiction? Should there be a blanket ban because there are ethical considerations and ideological conflicts relating to this question at the international level?
Yeah, that question makes me sweat. That's definitely a question for the government to answer. I think what we have in Seychelles is a unique situation from the point of view that the market has considerably changed, and we need to adapt what the situation is here. We need to change the regulations, adapt the regulations to try and maybe reduce the number that are being produced until such time as that. I don't think you're ever going to stop the trade. There is the benefit of the regulations that you do have. We do have data that we can see those graphs, right? If we didn't have CITES, we wouldn't be able to see what the trade was happening within all those countries. But yeah, I think until we get a handle on the situation, it wouldn't be a bad idea to maybe stop. But that's not for me to say. I think the state has to decide what they want to do about that.
You know, we are facing the same dilemma, but in the context of regulating elephants,
Right.
exportation of elephants
Yeah.
and ivory
Yeah.
in Southern Africa,
Yeah.
Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, and perhaps Zambia. They are arguing that our elephants are way too many,
Yeah.
and they are wreaking havoc in communities, destroying crops. Yet elsewhere, they are endangered, and the international community, they simply gather and they put a blanket ban on
Yeah.
exportation.
On how you control.
So should we go by this international standard of imposing bans, or countries should be given some sovereign rights to manage their populations based on whether or not they are in excess or they are threatened?
Sure. But I mean, that is the point of CITES, right? Like when you meet up at CITES meetings, you're supposed to talk about these discussions and where there's fairness in terms of how one country can trade and one country can't. And to your point, like, yeah, if you're having ecosystem detriment because your population is overrun and you need to find a way to control that, you still need some kind of oversight over how that is done. For example, with the breeding here, it's like if you said no, stop the breeding here, but then you've got breeders in Hong Kong, Taiwan, US, all breeding, you know, that doesn't seem right either, because they're breeding something from a country that's
Okay, so
not
I
there.
have 2 points. This was my first one. Then my second one is in relation to translocation and movement of some of these species against biosecurity risks and threats to other ecosystems. You are moving species from Aldabra and you are moving them to Silhouette or to UK or any other country, and there are other regulations elsewhere whereby you don't have to bring new species. Yes, you have talked of quarantine, but there are regulations at national level whereby you have to,
UN,
to be mindful of biosecurity risks and threats to the ecosystems. How do you reconcile the two,
So then-
translocation and regulation?
Well, I think we reconcile it by the benefit of having the tortoises on the islands in Mauritius, for example, is far better than not having the tortoises there for the risk of potentially introducing something. There's so much already introduced that the tortoises then take care of, that you're kind of outweighing that risk in our opinion. You can, certainly the quarantine is essential, but when if we're not sending them to the UK to start like rewilding, I don't know, the moors of Cornwall or something, but like we would only ever focus on islands that either had giant tortoises, so there's the Mauritian ones, for example, or the Madagascan ones, where you're directly replacing those extinct ones with an ancestor or a related species. So they're not the same species, but they're very, very closely related and perform the same functions. So the risk, even though you can follow all the UN guidelines, which everyone does, you're not, with animals like tortoises, there's not the same kind of diseases that you have with mammals, for example. The risk of not doing it is probably worse, is the way we justify it.
Thank you.
But I can talk more about the CITES stuff another time.
Just two questions. Probably you've covered them, or probably not. With regards to rewilding, which you're promoting for island restorations, are there studies that have been done to show that tortoises are more effective at spreading native plant species in terms of seed dispersal as opposed to invasive or introduced species? Are there concrete evidence that it is safe to use tortoise for rewilding when at the same time you want to control invasive species? And in my opinion, tortoise eat both, both invasive and introduced. So isn't there a risk in that process?
Yes. I mean, well, I don't know what the risk would be. Like, we know if they've got access to both, they're going to eat both, most likely. The seeds that germinate, the important ones that you want germinating are the large tree seeds that benefit from going through the tortoise. Grass seeds, invasive grass seeds, weeds, and this kind of thing are likely to germinate as well, but they're also more likely to be trampled and eaten by the giant tortoises, so have less chance of establishing than compared to a native tree species. So that's what we're doing now. So our seed germination is looking at cocoa plum, Indian almond, and takamaka to see the differences between. It's very likely that cocoa plum benefits from being in a tortoise, for sure. But it's just how you, again, that's when your conservation action, when you're removing cocoa plum, for example, you want to do this in tandem with the giant tortoises. And then you should start over time to see a benefit of the tortoises eating seedlings of cocoa plum rather than just the fruit. But that's an island management question, not just a rewilding question. But yeah, no, it's a good point. There has been one study in Mauritius where they looked at the different seed types, invasive versus, and it was kind of the same. Like, there was no significant difference whether invasive benefited or not. So it's a question you should always have in your mind when you're doing this work. Yeah.
You also mentioned on the graph, so we have one, whereby, especially the frigate scenario, whereby after eradication, there has been an increase in tortoise population in frigate. Now, assuming that rat is a predator in a way, but why is it not the case on Aldabra, where there are rats?
Well, I mean, if we look at the curves from the population demography of Aldabra, you're not seeing babies, right? You don't see the babies. So if either that's because they're cryptic and you can't find them, or there is such heavy predation by the rats that they're not actually surviving. So we know the rails hit them, we know the crows hit them, we know the rats hit them, cats probably as well. So it's a worry. And I think that's why Aldabra are pushing, or SIF are pushing to try and do an eradication there. It's the same when you look at Curious. Curious Island should have a very large population of tortoise. They were brought there at the same time as Frigate, but have had rats for a very long time. They were knocked down a while ago, came back up, and they're not finding babies. And you can assume that the pressure from rats is just extreme. That's why we're doing the project there. Thanks. Lindsay.
To answer, as a possible answer to your question, when is
too many, yeah.
Can you foresee the day when the tortoise steak will be one of the favored dishes prized by visiting tourists? all locals on Saturday morning, what would IOTA's stance be on something like that?
Say that again, sorry?
IOTA.
Yeah.
Would IOTA be against tortoise meat becoming like mutton or beef?
Tortoise meat?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I mean,
Against it or?
I'm not going to say whether I'm against it or not, because but I mean, when you read about how tasty it was, then it's surprising that no one really does it anymore. So
There's a lot of people who do.
I think turtle is definitely up there. I don't know about the tortoise side of thing, but I think we would probably be against it. Yeah, I think it's not great to eat iconic endemic animals.
I know for a fact, in my family, my mom used to say she wouldn't eat giant tortoises because it tastes of the earth.
Oh,
And I was telling that story to the assistant commissioner of police who was a European origin. He said, rubbish, bring all the tortoise meat and I'll eat it.
okay. I mean, they in the 1600s, 1700s, they really enjoyed it. But luckily, cuisine changed up on boats, and then or they ran out of tortoises that they couldn't eat them anymore.
Yeah.
Gerard.
Yeah, maybe it's not just a question,
Yeah.
maybe as a concluding remark. I think what we can say from what we've been doing in Seychelles about giant tortoises is that we have not been doing much. Actually, so little that even people from Mauritius are doing much more
Exactly.
than what we're doing here. And what you explained. We are of course doing, and you've shown the translocation we've done to Arif and to Answer, etc. But look at La Réserve de la Vanille in Mauritius, where they are at least putting some, the animal, into perspective, making it available for people to more entities, multiplying them to produce, then to repopulate, not just to sell to tourists, no, to repopulate and create other reserves in Audrey, now in Madagascar. And this is a private, in fact, private initiative from Agriculture and Greenpeace.
Yeah.
So here, unfortunately, we have not been able in Seychelles so far, even just to create something attractive. I can only think about the botanical gardens where there's been an improvement, but until like 10 years ago it was really appalling. My office was there, I remember it very well. So I think here, one of the problems in Seychelles is that we haven't yet understood that this animal is an icon. Now, and that we are not up to what we should be doing here, even just in terms of showing to the people outside of Seychelles, how these animals used to be before, etc. Except if you go to islands like Fregat or Cousine, etc. One of the reasons here why we're not doing this is because of security. We start doing this here, people will come, steal the tortoises. The other problem is the appalling conditions that these animals are being kept. And the government is not doing much about it. And this is where we should say, okay, you want to have tortoise in captivity, fine, but you need to have minimum area for tortoise, per tortoise, or water, etc. Finally, on the research side, I think what we haven't yet been looked at sufficiently is the relationships between the giant tortoises and the ecosystem as a whole, but the vegetation in particular. Before humans came on these islands, the dominant animal was the giant tortoise. say also the crocodiles maybe in the coastlines, but the giant tortoises. And then you look at all these vines that are growing on the palms, which were much probably more abundant in the past than they are now, when we have so many broadleaf invasive trees. Well, all these palms, they all have spines to protect them against who? All giant tortoises, probably, because they were here and they were dominant and they were everywhere.
Yeah.
And if you look at Fauvel and or Expedition Marine Dufresne, every single line was full of them. So I think there's still some research questions that we should look at to understand much better what these big giants can bring to our ecosystems. I think we are on the right path, and certainly I'm very happy to see that IOTA has now taken the lead into this and develop all these restoration projects and promotion.
Well, one of the things we'd like to see is obviously a lot of focus is marine in research in Seychelles, and I'm very biased towards terrestrial, so it would be nice to try and get more research excited about the terrestrial side. There is a lot of impressive work being done here in the past, and it would be nice to keep that going, keep that momentum going, get the students involved. There's a lot of research to be done comparatively with Madagascar and Mauritius Rodrigues. So I think from a regional cooperation point of view as well, it could be very interesting to tie those research bits together.
Yeah, one last thing maybe is that we shouldn't think that these animals are island animals. These animals used to be in the mainlands, and the giant tortoises. I cannot tell you exactly when, but certainly further back to 1,000 years that we mentioned. They were in East Africa. They were, of course,
All over the world.
So all over the world in different continents. So they've been eliminated probably because humans, humans has happened with so many large animals. So we should keep this in mind. In fact, they are refuged themselves in places like Aldabrachelys, Seychelles. In fact, these animals are elsewhere everywhere. The Megaherbivores that others were very slow to capture, so probably were the first to disappear.
Exactly. But we can put them back pretty quickly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Just picking on from my colleague, what I'm saying that is so much lacking is awareness creation. In your early intro, when you're introducing the topic, you mentioned that you visit schools and all that. I come from the media background. I have a strong feeling that if there is a vibrant media that can articulate some of these findings in a simple language that the ordinary person can understand, it can be an avenue through which the wider audience will pick interest in these things. The role of the media primarily is to educate, inform, perhaps even entertain. So if this study or research could be accompanied or translated into a movie or a film, could be part of the idea of interesting the wider audience. And there is what we call the Environment Media Association. They usually have annual awards for environment reports. So who knows if someone came up with this, it would be a very good thing to feature.
Thanks, That's a good point. Yeah, we work hard on trying to disseminate the research through our social media with summaries, I guess, of the research that's happened.
Yeah.
We're very lucky in that we can utilize such an iconic species. So people are always excited to see them. But I completely agree, there needs to be, I think, certainly more locally driven media outreach. That would be really good, for sure. Elka.
Seagrass project tried reaching out to the media, booked a massive auditorium, really showed up. Just a heads up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to compare seagrass to tortoises, but I'm going to go with tortoises might get 4 people. Lindsay?
Following up on the gentleman said over there, I don't know if you remember the incident where a giant tortoise walked out of the sea in Dar es Salaam,
Of course.
covered with gooseneck barnacles. I got a call from a script writer from Hollywood. It was around the time when the animated film
Start.
Nemo,
Yeah.
the clownfish. He was quite interested in trying to write a film about that, but
Nothing happened.
so far nothing.
No, there's always a lot of people. I mean, Aldabra is obviously where a lot of filmmakers want to try and get to, and it's very difficult. And SIF make that happen for a lot of people. But we're trying to get people interested in what's happening more on the inner islands and to some of the projects. So hopefully in the future we'll get some more of that going. Hi.
Thank you for a very insightful presentation. I had the opportunity to visit the Aldabra Reserve in Greece a couple of years ago. What they're doing there is absolutely amazing. But the one thing that surprised me while I was there and when I left is because I was a Seychelles, I understood a bit more than other visitors where the tortoise came from. Because there was no mention of Seychelles at all. Perhaps they mentioned Aldabra, but most visitors do not know where Aldabra is. Because you spoke about the tortoise being the ambassadors, in a way, for Seychelles. And so I was a bit surprised and disappointed that they sort of left Seychelles out of the conversation. Perhaps they want to focus more on their local project, but yeah, that's perhaps a concern that I have.
Yeah.
Again, I don't know if that's only unique to that reserve or if we encounter similar situations in other countries. That's one question, comment that I have. Second question is, you mentioned that a lot of Seychelles obviously have pets, tortoise pets at home. Is this something that IOTA is encouraging or discouraging people to have pets at home? And yeah, because that's something that maybe is been around in my mind, but of course there's a lot of consideration, a lot of things to think about. Because you want to do it for the best interest of the animal and the environment in which it will live. So that's
Yeah. No, great. To the first comment, it's similar to what Gerard was saying as well. I completely agree. So one of the things we realised was that it works both ways, right? So Seychelles doesn't know how much work is going on in Mauritius with the species that's from Seychelles, right? So we're definitely pushing that angle to try and get Seychelles to realise that the work of this endemic animal is doing amazing stuff in Mauritius, and we want it to do amazing stuff in Seychelles. At the same time, over there they do, and I focus on when we talk to the institutions that have Aldabra giant tortoises, I try and find their signs that they have on the enclosures and habitats, as they call them, to see how much is mentioned about Seychelles, and it's usually very, very little. There might be one thing about Aldabra atoll, and that's it. There's no really. So what I'd like to see, we'd like to try and work with tourism on, is encouraging all of these different institutions to have a QR code or something that people can scan. It goes straight back to Tourism Seychelles or something to do with Seychelles, where people can actually physically see. Because when I was in the States, we gave a huge presentation. We made an enclosure with a guy that keeps them as pets, and we had banners and everything. But the main question was where is Seychelles? Kind of thing, and it was this is the thing about them being ambassadors. It's not just about the animal; it's about the country. So yeah, definitely it needs to be improved, like without doubt. So we are pushing for that. The pet thing, that's a government department decision. We are working closely with them to try and improve guidelines that help people keep them better. So that's our role in this. The tradition of keeping them has been for a very, very long time. They are part of the family to some extent, but there does need to be some changes in terms of how they're, especially the hotels, because they're usually some of the worst culprits. But yeah, great points. Thank you.
I forgot to say that as you were speaking, I was checking the Canada Reserve also on our website and Seychelles. I did not see the Seychelles mentioned at all.
So yeah.
Which is quite sad. Aldabra was mentioned 1 or 2 times, but Seychelles itself, the country, was not mentioned.
Yeah, no, we're definitely working to try and change that and improve that. It needs to be known.
That's definitely no, it's a very good point. I think because IFI is a regional alliance, that's also the platform where we can bring this up.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, we really need to, we should not expect others to put ourselves forward. We have to do it. The answer is we have to do a good presentation, valorization, I don't know how to say that, of the giant tortoises, so that when people come to Mauritius or to the Aldabrachelys, that these are models from Seychelles. You see, we have to reach the wide audience and make it ours, because it is ours. But if we don't do anything with it, then the other place is very difficult. You do not expect other people to promote, for whatever reasons, because they have no interest in something that they are. So I think it works both ways. We also have our work to do here.
We do. Yeah. We had the workshop last year where we invited people from Mauritius, Rodrigues, and Reunion Madagascar to come over and present some of the work they're doing. That went really well, and I think it was the first time here that people had seen the work. First time in 50 years of research that anyone's actually gone and talked about it. So there is a ton of work to do. So it's a giant amount of work to do, if you will. So yeah, that's what we're here to do.
Okay, is there any more questions? Sorry.
Just wanted to ask, what's IOTA's position regarding Arnold tortoise? Do you think it's a myth or still one of your research projects? Or?
There is only one species of giant tortoise currently extant in the Seychelles, and that's Aldabrachelys gigantea.
So you think the Arnold tortoise never existed?
Arnold not genetically, no.
Okay, sorry.
Joseph?
You mentioned the tortoise census
Yep.
taking place. Is it close to complete, or is there an indication on a figure?
Yeah, so a lot of the hotels have been looked at now, and then now it's the time to encourage private owners to register the tortoises, and then we'll get a good picture about what's happening. Then they'll.
You're doing homes. You're doing only hotels.
No, that's so the hotels first, because they're easier to contact, and then now we'd like private owners to register their tortoises. So homeowners, people
What's
that.
the incentive?
What's the incentive?
What's the incentive to Baxter?
To contribute to tortoise conservation. Because it's a good thing to do. They did it last time in 2015. And they're going to get so one of the reasons for doing it is we want to microchip all the tortoises. So you'll have your own barcode for your tortoise. So you know that's your tortoise. So if it goes missing or whatever, it can potentially be refound.
Pay for this microchip?
Not at the moment, but
No, because like they're trying to register the dogs, And
Yeah,
the
I-
answer is if you don't register it, you get fined.
Is it, no, it's an interesting question, but that's not happening, right? There's no enforcement of that. So there's no point in trying to incentivize people with that sort of pressure. We're hoping that people, through goodwill, will just be like, yeah, this is cool. We're not going to get all of them, for sure, but we'll get close, I hope. But that's the plan.
Just wanted to add something regarding
Lindsay.
Lindsay's question. Did we have another species
Arnold,
of
I am.
importance here? Personally, I think that, apart from the fact that the genetics of the giant tortoises are going to be very difficult to
Yeah.
favors but when you have an animal that is able to disperse so well in the giant tortoises, I have a friend who works on a Spanish vessel. They found 2 of them on East area. You can see here in the country for about 30 years. They've had 2 in their nets. So when you have an animal like this that can survive for 6 months without eating, without drinking at sea, you spoke, someone spoke, Lindsay, about the one that reached Zanzibar from Aldabra, which is 900 kilometers away. And so when you have such a mobile animal, such a long-lived animal, because that's important also, the fact it's a long-lived animal. The connectivity in this population, the genetic connectivity, I think has always been between Aldabra and the Atlantic Islands. Now, we may have a situation, or we may have had a situation, a little bit like we have with the bats, because their bats also can fly, they have wings, they have, but we still have 3 different types of bat species or subspecies, depends how. One on Seychelles, one on Aldabra, one on Comores. Maybe a situation like sister species, you can call it, you can see a subspecies with them.
Yeah.
But in any case, not very different.
Yeah, I want to show you, if I have time, just this slide here. Okay, so this is some of the other research that's been going on. And I think this starts to answer that question a little bit. The idea that there was other species of giant tortoise in Seychelles is very exciting. It would make it comparable to Galapagos kind of thing with the subspecies. But because tortoises are so plastic in their environment, really affects how they're shaped. What we can see here, so this is from last year, where they took blood samples from across Aldabra with the newer genome that we've completed. Okay, and we can see they're all very closely related. If you expand this graph out, you can make it seem as if they're completely separate species. But you can see, even with this scaling of graph, there's clusters based on where they're from on the atoll. And I'm not a geneticist, so bear with me. So what you're seeing, I'll use the pointer for those that are online. So you've got these clusters here that may look like they're closely related, but there is some separation, right? Is that separation enough to be considered a separate species? And the answer here is no. But what you do have something is very interesting, is that between the 2 groups on Malabar, so you've got Malabar group 1 and group 2, they are very distinct as a Aldabrachelys gigantea. For some reason, this group of tortoises, which is from this part of Malabar, has a very different makeup to Malabar group 2. And that's what you see here. So these green diamonds here is Malabar group 1, and this is group 2. So if you're looking at the genetic diversity from a speciation point of view, and you're seeing this signal and you're thinking, and then you measure the different types of bones and all this kind of stuff, you might come to the conclusion that they're separate species. But using the genome, we can see they are very closely related, but there's no mixture between these 2 groups, very little mixture between these 2 groups. So this is something we're still working on. And the other thing about this story is that this goes back, as you were saying about the age, 500 years, 600 years, because the generational time is so slow. So any kind of changes that we would like to see are going to take thousands and thousands of years. So I think that we're getting to that point now. We have sampled the Arnold eye from Silhouette to put into the cluster and see where it comes out. But there have been we've done other work on the genetics. Here is another one where we have the distribution of Aldabra giant tortoises, which is the blue, so that's from Aldabra atoll. Then we have Mauritius and Rodrigues, so they're all nice and clustered there. So they're all nestled in amongst this. There's some genetic drift happening, but there are 3 individuals on Rodrigues and 1 in Mauritius that had quite a different genetic makeup from the rest, and we're still not quite sure why that is. But it could be. It's not a separate species, but they just might have different alleles from before they were moved in the 1800s, when that population was very, very low. So there's still a ton of work to do, but now we have the genome, which is this beautiful diagram on the side here. We can do a lot. We can investigate these questions much more thoroughly. Lindsay.
Last time we spoke, you were looking for giant tortoises older than 70 years.
Yes.
Did you manage to find some?
We're still looking. So we're also looking at aging. So this is how we can use epigenetic biomarkers using the genome to try and take blood samples from known-aged, we test it with known-aged tortoises. So you can't age a tortoise based on its size. It just means it's eaten a lot. Okay? You need to judge, the only way you can really do it is through records. So some people says, like, my grandmother had a tortoise when she was a child, it was this age, she is now 93, the tortoise is 93-ish. That's what we're looking for. It's very hard to find. We've done adverts, gone to people. We found some old ones that people know records for, or people that have understanding for. What we're really looking for now is older females of known age. So female tortoises between the ages of 50 and 70. That would be very helpful for testing it. Then after that, we can. So the oldest one we have of known record is 105. If we could get, the oldest tortoise in the world is Jonathan, who lives on St. Helena, and he's supposedly 192 years old. If we're able to get a blood sample from him, then we can potentially test exactly how old he is, because it could be plus or minus 50 years. So we just need to find some more of these tortoises. So if anybody's out there that has a tortoise that they know is 70 years old, please do get in touch.
Go on TV.
Yeah, we've done the radios and newspaper and stuff, but nothing yet. Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.